Hello and welcome to All the Games You Like Are Bad. I'm your 3 for a Silver Mark Bigney, and today we're going to be talking about Shadowrift by Jeremy Anderson. Shadowrift is a cooperative deck-building game that has now recently entered its second edition as of this year. And before we go any further, I'd like to draw a distinction between what I would call a deck-builder game or a game with a deck-building element on the other hand. A game with a deck-building element is one where by the end of the game your deck might have changed, but mostly you're going to be dealing with cards that you started the game with, or at least it's not unusual to be in that situation. An example of that might be Mage Knight, where you get new cards, but often you're going to be dealing with your original cards, or a game like Cry Havoc, where again, mostly your deck is going to look very similar to how it started the game. On the other hand, we have games like Dominion, where, generally speaking, with most card sets, the overwhelming majority of cards are going to be new ones that you purchased, or a game like Shadowrift, where, again, your deck is going to change substantially. And deck builders are great. Deck building games are in many ways the apotheosis of Euro design, or sort of the epitome of stereotypes about Euros. They're smooth playing, they're fast playing, you get a genuine sense of organic progression as your deck changes. When done well, there's lots of variety. But there are two huge problems, which again, sometimes are endemic to the Euro school of design. One of them is that lots of deck builders are multiplayer solitaire. You don't have any meaningful interaction with the other players. And when you do have interaction in deck builders, often it serves primarily to make the game less fun. Consider the Witch in Dominion, who serves only to make the rest of your opponent's decks less fun to play, so not exactly ideal. There was a game called Nightfall, which again tried to bring in player interaction into the deck builder genre, but mostly you won by making everyone else's deck stink. And that's just not a fun experience, generally speaking, either for the attacker or the one being attacked. Another problem that deck builders often have is that the hands play themselves. When a card gets into your hand, you don't really have any choices about how to play the hand. All the decisions come from what you buy, how you change the deck. Now, sometimes that's more problematic than others. There's a stereotype about Dominion that is sometimes, but not always true, that when you see the 10 cards that are available for your session of Dominion, you then make your one and only decision, which is, what cards would I like to buy? And then the rest of the game just plays itself, and you see who made the better decision and or got more lucky. Enter cooperative deck builders, of which Shadowrift is an example. Now, cooperative games, generally speaking, can't be multiplayer solitaire, or when they are, it's usually very aberrant. You have to coordinate with the other players to deal with the threats that are coming at you collectively. So, usually they have an easy time addressing that first problem of deck builders being multiplayer solitaire. Then the question is, can we make a game where the second issue is addressed, namely, you have choices about how to play your hand? Let's take a look. So, Shadowrift is not multiplayer solitaire. There's the necessity of coordination and sometimes even some degree of specialization. There's a number of different tasks that you're going to be able to do with your various decks, and it's unreasonable or inefficient for one person to be able to take care of all of them simultaneously. You're going to need someone to take care of monsters, possibly several people. You're going to have to do some other tasks. There are some support skills that people can invest in, and then there are a whole bunch of other things that are introduced into the formula in an attempt to make the pool of information deeper and thus hopefully make the decision tree deeper. For example, in Shadowrift you have all these villagers that show up. The theme of the game is that you're defending a village from these attacking monsters. And while the rulebook does a good job of making fun of these villagers as being hapless, they do help you out here and there. So you have to decide how to use those resources, and those aren't in your deck, although you can manipulate them. There's a separate deck that you collectively will be building with your friends, and that is adding new villagers into the town. You know, some wandering bard comes by. Well, let's hire her and have her help us on the regular, as it were. Now, that's more purchasing decisions. But in terms of triaging threats, how to deploy your attacks, there is some degree of added depth as opposed to just what you're going to buy. You need to figure out who to attack, how to use your skills, things like that. So, it's not necessarily the deepest decision-making game, but it's pretty good. And I will say that when you're looking at your hand of cards in Shadowrift, a consequence of the purchasing decisions you made several turns ago, you do have a greater sense of control over what to do with these things than your average run-of-the-mill deck builder, like, for example, Dominion, or even more refined, streamlined games like Star Realms. In Star Realms, you just plop out your hand, and the hand does what it does. You don't really choose how it works. It just does what it does. Now, whether you think that's an advantage or a deterrent is really up to you. I don't really like it when a deck builder strips away all the decision-making when I'm sitting there looking at my hand, because then I just feel like I'm just shuffling cards the entire time and just waiting for a random number generator to spit out whose buying decisions were better. looking at the threats that Shadowrift throws at me, trying to make those triage decisions, I do find enjoyable, and I think it's an evolution and an advance on a lot of standard garden variety deck builders. Now, the second edition of Shadowrift also adds some improvements over its first edition. In the first edition of Shadowrift, often the early purchasing decisions were very straightforward. You purchase the cards that improve your economy. You pay 3 for a silver. The number of deck building games where you have 3 for a silver staggers the imagination. It doesn't matter how they juice the economy, doesn't matter how they change what the economy represents. Usually in a deck building game, there's a card that costs 3 and gives you 2 monies. And sure enough, Shadowrift did something roughly similar. There was this card called Might that wasn't more valuable in and of itself, but anytime you drew it, you would draw another card. So it didn't add to the cruft of your hand and let you make more purchasing decisions. And so generally speaking, the early turns of Shadowrift, everyone just buys those up. In the second edition, they change it. Might it works the same way, and it's slightly cheaper, but when you use it, it goes away forever. You have to burn it in order to use it. And as a result, it's not a trivial, straightforward decision anymore, because you know it's only going to be a one-shot. Might still be something you want, and it's not useless or imbalanced, but it nonetheless means that your early buying decisions aren't trivial. There are lots of other things you can do with your early money, rather than just investing in your future economy. And that's another thing that I really find interesting in deck builders, how they try to avoid the game being entirely about managing the economy. Speaking personally, as someone who, broadly speaking, enjoys deck builders, I'm tired of paying 3 for a silver. I'm tired of managing my money, using my money to buy more money that gets me more money or possibly better things. I really like it when they find ways to minimize my influence over the economy. Shadowrift 2nd Edition does a reasonably good job of doing that. Another example of a game that does that really well that I really enjoy is another co-op deck builder, which is XenoShyft. In XenoShyft, you have precisely 0 control over the economy. You will be buying no money cards. The money takes care of itself. The economy ramps up organically just by virtue of the fact that every turn you get more money into your hand, but as the turns go on, those monies get more and more powerful. And so you don't have to worry about this comparatively boring question of paying money for more money. You can instead focus on the more interesting cards like action cards and soldier cards. And indeed, one of the traps for new players in Dominion is until you know what you're doing, you're probably better off buying money, which is not super exciting, all things considered. Now, XenoShyft does have that second problem that I mentioned, though. The hands more or less play themselves, because in Shadowrift, you're dealing with known threats, and so you have to work with your resources to triage where you're going to put your damage. In XenoShyft, your threats are unknown. They just show up randomly and only last a turn. So when you have your hand of resources, you might as well just plop them out in the same way, more or less every time. While I do enjoy XenoShyft, it does have that problem of hands being more or less on autopilot. Now, another game in the co-op deck building genre is Shadowrun Crossfire. Shadowrun Crossfire, according to the distinction that I introduced at the beginning, isn't actually really a deck building game because, again, mostly you'll be managing your original cards. It's more of a game with deck building elements. But the economy in Shadowrun is similarly satisfying in that you don't spend cards to buy other cards. The money comes exclusively from kills. Shadowrun is also notorious for being brutally difficult, which is a reputation that I think is well-deserved. And it does have a sort of proto-legacy aspect. You have little stickers to improve your characters. You acquire experience points from fight to fight. Anyway, I think Shadowrun is also a worthy example of what you can do in the co-op space with mild deck-building elements, but with an emphasis on teamwork and coordination. Anyhow, back to Shadowrift. Having briefly discussed some of the problems of some of its competitors, let me talk about the problems that Shadowrift, has and still has in the 2nd edition. There is a lot of procedural upkeep. Now, the word fiddly means lots of different things to lots of different people, so I'm just going to call this procedural upkeep. There are so many things to do over the course of a turn. There are like 7 or 8 phases in every turn that deal with 4 or more decks. You're going to be shuffling and placing cards a lot before you get to the actual decision making. And that kind of disrupts the cleanliness that deck builders often have. In a deck builder, usually you just have to shuffle your own deck, often enough, which is tedious, but then you've got your hand and that's it. Play your hand, draw, play your hand, draw. In Shadowrift, it's more like play your hand, draw, refresh this deck, refresh this display, shuffle this, add tokens here, reveal a card, move it over, do a thing, now do some more actions. And it's not the end of the world, but it is a bit grating. Another problem that Shadowrift has is that, honestly, it's still pretty easy. The game is not terribly difficult. After your first couple of setups, you're probably going to have a win ratio well in excess of 80%. And the problem is sometimes it becomes clear that you're going to win the game, you're just burning time to wear out the clock. Because although in theory there are two ways to win Shadowrift, in my experience there's really only one that's viable, or one that's much more efficient, and where you don't suffer setbacks. And the way you do that victory condition is you just wait out the deck, effectively. And then something shows up, you smack it down, you wait for the next one to show up, you smack it down, and once you've smacked up all those special threats, namely the Shadowrifts, you've won the game. And that's fine. I don't find that unsatisfying as an endgame. I just find it unsatisfying as a mid-game to say, okay, we're as powerful as we need to be, we can manage threats, let's just wear out these turns. And when the game is easy, and when managing those threats can be relatively straightforward, that's a problem. Can this be addressed by house rules? Yeah, but again, I'm not particularly inclined to do the designer's work for them. So while there are things that I might be inclined to tinker with to improve the core formula by making it harder, that shouldn't be my job. Another problem that Shadowrift has is that it really is a textbook case in how not to do additions. To a certain extent, I realize this is more or less a first-time designer working more or less on his own, doesn't have a large support staff, but there are a number of errors here that I think are borderline unforgivable. The second edition corrected some problems, and indeed made some gameplay advancements, but it introduced new ones. There are, as of this recording, several misprints and or errata. There was a card that was grossly misprinted with wrong values. There are a number of cards the designer already says he wants to change because they were too powerful or too weak. The FAQ/errata thread is several pages long, and the game has only been in the hands of Kickstarter backers for a few days. There are new effects that should have been keywords that are just explaining the cards. That don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense sometimes. You have to figure them out as you go. There are no reference cards, and as I said, there are a whole bunch of phases you just have to use the back of the rulebook. But in the first edition, there were reference cards, both for how to build walls and for the phase structure, both of which, by the way, are pretty necessary. Gone, not there anymore. It's also the case that the recently released expansions are a bit of a train wreck, to be quite honest. And to a certain extent, deck builders live or die on expansions. They thrive in environments where there's tons of variety and you can play with different setups, and that's where expansions come in. The second expansion, the one that was released more recently, which just added more cards, which is always a good thing for deck builders, did not come with any rules at all. There's not even a little slip in there, just cards. And I'm sorry, I don't care that you think that it's obvious that you just shuffle them in. That's completely unacceptable. You don't get to do that. Don't do it. Furthermore, it's even more unacceptable because it's... Okay, you can keep it together. Go to your happy place. All right, okay, you've got your sugar-free Kool-Aid. Okay, you've got your fun-sized Snickers bar, and you've got the best rule book ever written. You've got the combat, so well indexed, such a great table of contents, so Pierre Elliott Trudeau quotes, and everything's gonna be just... Wait, did you hear that? Well, wait, what was that? Oh no! It's the Fantasy Flight multi-book format. Where's the setup? Where are the victory conditions? Where do I find the turn structure? Is it in the center of the... No, fucking keep away from me! Moving on, I'd therefore like to applaud Shadowrift in the model of Apple computing for having the courage to dispense with a feature that millions of people use on a daily basis. So really, I look forward to a brave new world where nothing comes with rules anymore, and everyone needs to figure out through scattered breadcrumbs of forum posts about how something is actually supposed to be integrated with the base game. Because one might be sufficiently naive as to think that the cards are merely to be shuffled in with all the base game material. No. It's not that simple. And if you played that way, as I did for a couple of games, you're obviously an idiot. Because you're supposed to replace some cards with other cards, there's supposed to be a ratio that's to be maintained, all of which, could have been included in a rules document, but I, for one, am glad that they had the bold vision of leading us into this new world of incomprehensible nonsense. It's also the case that the second expansion, while it has new monsters and such, also had the courage to dispense with a feature that the first edition had, namely recommended setups. The different monsters required different kinds of tools to address and different kinds of strategies to implement. And ever since the first edition came out with, recommended first-time setups, there was a change.org petition signed by, I think, well over 250,000 people that demanded that no future monster setups ever include this useful feature. And so the publisher clearly caved to the pressure. Good for them, responding to their viewership, and now has no guidance about how to do a first-time setup for any of the new monsters. Yay. Also, in terms of progress, there's the matter of the first expansion, Archfiends. It was released not that long ago, and they've clearly decided that it wasn't a very good expansion because they don't intend to make future expansions compatible with it at all. There's no plans at the moment to have any bosses be introduced for the new monster types. So, congratulations, you can either play with the content from the second expansion in terms of the monsters, or you can play with the content from the first expansion, but not both, because both at the same time, expansion compatibility would just be too much for your average consumer. So again, I applaud the publisher for leading to a brand new world. There's been some comment that maybe there might be a second printing of the first expansion, but, in all seriousness now, I'm going to drop the sarcasm. If we're going to get into a new printing every time they want to address some base changes or incompatibilities, that might be where I get off the train. And it's really a shame, because I think that with a cleaner version, I think that with slightly more care given to how they were going to put out expansions, then I could recommend Shadowrift unreservedly as possibly the best deck builder in the market, certainly for my taste, because it seems to address some of those fundamental problems that other deck builders seem to have. But the problem is it's a little clunky in its implementation. I'm not sure much can be done about that. And really, the way that the expansions have been released and the way that new problems have been introduced in the new editions and in the new expansions doesn't lead to a whole lot of confidence to the game's future. I hope I'm wrong. I sincerely hope that going forward, everything is going to be much smoother than it has been in the past. And quite frankly, I don't know who to blame. It's been published by Game Salute. A lot of people have serious problems with Game Salute. Quite frankly, I'm not aware of all those issues, and I don't even know if it's a general problem of this type that they tend to have. But at any rate, as it is, Shadowrift is a very fun game, but it is one among many. I like XenoShyft and I like Shadowrun as cooperative deck-building games. Shadowrift has a lot of neat innovations, but it doesn't quite rise above the pack by virtue of some of these problems. But I still enjoy it, I still play it, I can recommend it, I think you should give it a shot, but it's a crowded field. That having been said, maybe you don't mind multiplayer solitaire. Maybe all you want to do is look at a tableau of 10 cards, make a couple decisions, and then have a random number generator spit out who the winner is going to be based on hand draws. If so, honestly, I think you're wrong, but I'll forgive you. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and take care.